The radio crackled with static as Sergeant Jake Morrison crouched behind the overturned Humvee, watching the muzzle flashes light up the Afghan mountainside like deadly fireflies. His squad of 8 Marines had been cut off from their convoy 3 hours ago, and now they were trapped in a narrow valley with Taliban fighters closing in from 3 sides. The situation looked hopeless, and Morrison could see the fear creeping into his men's eyes as ammunition ran low and their options dwindled to nothing. Back at Camp Leatherneck, Colonel William Hayes paced the operations center, studying the tactical display with growing concern. The red dots representing hostile forces outnumbered the blue friendly markers by at least 4 to 1, and the terrain offered little advantage to the surrounded Marines. Intelligence reports suggested at least 60 enemy combatants had converged on Morrison's position, armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. Hayes had already lost 2 helicopters trying to reach them, and the nearest ground support was still hours away through treacherous mountain passes. Morrison checked his watch and realized they had been holding this position for nearly 4 hours now. The enemy had been probing their defenses, testing for weaknesses, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they launched a full assault. His radio operator, Corporal Martinez, looked up from his equipment with a grim expression. The batteries were dying, and their last communication with base had been over an hour ago. They were truly on their own now, surrounded and outgunned in hostile territory with no immediate hope of rescue. The first hook came when Morrison noticed something moving in the tree line about 800 meters to their north. At first, he thought it might be another enemy flanking maneuver, but the movement was too deliberate, too calculated. Someone was out there, and they were moving with a kind of precision that only came from years of specialized training. Morrison had heard whispers about ghost units operating in these mountains, special operations teams so classified that even Marine commanders weren't briefed on their activities. But those were just rumors, weren't they? Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and fresh out of boot camp, was beginning to panic. This was his first deployment, and the reality of combat was nothing like the training exercises back in California. The constant sound of incoming fire, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the knowledge that death could come at any moment was overwhelming his senses. He fumbled with his rifle, his hands shaking as he tried to load a fresh magazine. Morrison noticed the young Marine's distress and moved closer, speaking in calm, measured tones despite the chaos erupting around them, refused to give up on finding a way to extract them safely. The Taliban commander, Abdul Rashid, surveyed the trapped Americans through his binoculars and smiled coldly. These Marines had fought well, he admitted grudgingly, but their resistance was merely delaying the inevitable. His fighters had them completely surrounded, and soon he would add 8 more American dog tags to his collection. Rashid had been fighting foreign invaders in these mountains for over 2 decades, first against the Soviets and now against the Americans. He knew these valleys and ridges better than anyone, and he had used that knowledge to orchestrate dozens of successful ambushes. Back in the operations center, Lieutenant Sarah Chen was frantically coordinating rescue efforts from her position at the communications console. She had been tracking Morrison's squad since they first reported contact, and she felt a personal responsibility for their safety. Chen had graduated from the Naval Academy just 2 years ago, and this was her first assignment as a tactical operations officer. The weight of 8 lives hanging in the balance was almost crushing, but she refused to give up on finding a way to extract them safely. Morrison's ammunition count was critical now. Each Marine had perhaps 2 magazines left, maybe 3 if they were lucky. The Taliban fighters were getting bolder, moving closer with each probe, and Morrison knew they were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm his small force. He had already made peace with the possibility that none of them would see home again, but he was determined to make the enemy pay dearly for their victory. These were his men, his responsibility, and he would not let them down in their final moments. The second hook materialized when a single gunshot echoed across the valley, so quiet and distant that Morrison almost missed it among the constant chatter of automatic weapons fire. But something had changed in the enemy's behavior immediately afterward. The probing attacks suddenly stopped, and there was a noticeable gap in their perimeter where heavy fire had been coming from just moments before. Morrison strained his eyes against the darkness, trying to understand what was happening out there in the shadows beyond their defensive position. Corporal Davis, the squad's designated marksman, had noticed the same thing. Through his rifle scope, he could see Taliban fighters looking around in confusion, their formation beginning to waver as they lost contact with their forward elements. Someone was out there picking off their spotters and communications personnel with surgical precision, but Davis couldn't identify the shooter's position. Whoever it was remained completely invisible, a phantom striking from the darkness with deadly accuracy and supernatural stealth. The mysterious marksman continued his methodical elimination of key enemy personnel, each shot carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact while remaining virtually undetectable. Taliban fighters began to look over their shoulders nervously, their confidence shaken by an opponent they couldn't see or locate. The tide of battle was shifting, but Morrison and his men were still unaware of their unseen guardian angel working tirelessly to thin the ranks of their would-be executioners. Staff Sergeant Williams, Morrison's second-in-command, had 22 years of military experience and had seen action in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen classified operations around the globe. But even he had never witnessed anything quite like what was happening tonight. Enemy fighters were simply vanishing from their positions without any apparent cause, their weapons falling silent one by one as an invisible force worked its way through their ranks with ruthless efficiency and professional precision. Rashid was beginning to realize that something was terribly wrong with his carefully planned ambush. His radio communications with forward positions had gone dead, and several of his most experienced fighters had failed to report in when expected. The Americans were still trapped and outnumbered, but some unknown element had entered the equation, someone with the skills and equipment to operate in complete darkness without detection. Rashid had encountered American special forces before, but this felt different somehow, more personal and infinitely more dangerous. The night air carried the faint scent of cordite and the distant sound of confused shouting in Pashto as Taliban fighters tried to reorganize their scattered forces. Morrison could sense the change in momentum, even if he couldn't fully understand its source. The enemy fire that had been so intense just minutes ago was now sporadic and unfocused, as if their attackers were more concerned with their own survival than pressing home their assault against the trapped Marines. Lieutenant Chen received an encrypted communication that made her pause mid-sentence during a coordination briefing with helicopter pilots standing by at forward operating base Shank. The message was brief, coded, and came from a source so classified that she didn't have clearance to know its identity. All it said was that friendly assets were operating in Morrison's area of operations and that extraction helicopters should be prepared to move on short notice. Chen had never seen anything like this communication protocol before, and she wondered what kind of unit could deploy without her knowledge. Private Martinez, the squad's radio operator, suddenly picked up a transmission on an encrypted channel that shouldn't have existed according to any frequency listings in his communications manual. The voice was calm, professional, and speaking in clear American English with a slight southern accent that reminded Martinez of his drill instructor back at Paris Island. The unknown operator was coordinating something, giving grid coordinates and target descriptions with a kind of clinical precision that came only from extensive combat experience and specialized training. The mysterious marksman had worked his way to within 300 meters of Morrison's position, moving through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate silently in complete darkness. His night vision equipment was more advanced than anything the regular military possessed, and his rifle was a custom-built precision instrument capable of making impossible shots under the most challenging conditions. He had been tracking this situation for hours, waiting for the optimal moment to intervene and turn the tide of battle. Morrison finally caught a glimpse of muzzle flash from an impossible angle, a position that no normal human could have reached without being detected by the Taliban fighters surrounding their perimeter. The shot came from a rocky outcropping that appeared completely inaccessible, yet someone had not only reached it but was using it as a firing position to systematically eliminate enemy targets with supernatural accuracy. Morrison began to understand that they had acquired an ally, someone operating far outside normal military protocols and capabilities. Rashid's tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as his fighters reported contact with an unknown sniper who seemed to anticipate their every movement. Veteran mujahideen who had survived decades of warfare were being eliminated with single shots from distances that should have been impossible in these lighting conditions. The American Marines were still trapped, but Rashid's overwhelming numerical advantage was evaporating as his most skilled fighters disappeared into the darkness one by one. The phantom marksman shots were creating gaps in the enemy encirclement, and Morrison realized this might be their only chance to break out of the kill zone. He began quietly passing instructions to his men, preparing them for a coordinated movement that would take advantage of the confusion their mysterious benefactor was creating among the Taliban forces. Williams understood immediately and began positioning the squad for a tactical withdrawal through the weakest point in the enemy perimeter. Corporal Johnson had stopped shaking and was now focused entirely on Morrison's hand signals, his earlier panic replaced by the steady concentration that comes from accepting mortal danger and choosing to face it with courage. The young Marine had found something inside himself during those terrifying hours of siege, a core of strength he never knew existed. Morrison watched Johnson prepare for what might be their final fight and felt a surge of pride in his youngest squad member's transformation from frightened boy to seasoned warrior. The Silent Guardian continued his methodical elimination of enemy personnel, each shot carefully selected to maximize tactical advantage while maintaining his own concealment and security. He had studied the terrain for days, memorizing every rock formation and shadow that could provide cover or concealment. His movement between firing positions was calculated to create the impression of multiple shooters operating in coordination, multiplying the psychological impact of his intervention. Staff Sergeant Williams recognized the tactical pattern emerging from their unseen allies' actions and began to understand how they might exploit the enemy's confusion to extract themselves from what had seemed like certain death just hours earlier. Williams had trained with various special operations units during his career, and he knew professional work when he saw it. Someone with extraordinary skills was giving them a chance to survive, and Williams was determined not to waste the opportunity. Chen received another encrypted message indicating that extraction helicopters should move to a new landing zone approximately 2 kilometers from Morrison's current position. The transmission included detailed information about enemy positions and safe routes that could only have come from someone with real-time intelligence on the ground. Chen began coordinating with pilots while wondering about the identity of the mysterious operator who seemed to have complete situational awareness of the battlefield. The Taliban fighters were beginning to withdraw from their advanced positions, falling back to more defensible terrain as their confidence in the ambush evaporated. Rashid could hear his men talking nervously about jinn and evil spirits. Their superstitions taking hold as rational explanations for their casualties became increasingly difficult to maintain. The carefully planned operation was falling apart, and Rashid knew he needed to either press the attack immediately or risk losing control of his fighters entirely. Morrison made his decision and signaled for the breakout to begin, trusting that their Phantom Protector would continue to provide covering fire during their most vulnerable moments. The 8 Marines moved as one unit, flowing through the darkness with practiced efficiency despite hours of intense combat stress. Years of training and absolute trust in each other allowed them to execute a textbook tactical withdrawal under conditions that would have paralyzed less experienced troops. The mysterious marksman shifted position again, this time moving to provide overwatch for the Marines' withdrawal route. His shots came faster now, suppressing enemy positions that might threaten the escaping Americans while maintaining the supernatural accuracy that had characterized his intervention throughout the long night. Each muzzle flash was precisely timed to maximize its protective effect while revealing nothing about the shooter's actual position or identity. Private Davis provided rear security as the squad moved through the rocky terrain, his rifle ready to engage any pursuing Taliban fighters who might try to follow their withdrawal. Davis had served 2 previous tours in Afghanistan and understood the importance of maintaining disciplined fire control during a tactical movement. The young Marine from Texas had proven himself a reliable soldier, and Morrison trusted him to guard their backs during the most dangerous phase of their escape. The extraction helicopters were now airborne and approaching the designated landing zone. Their crews briefed on the tactical situation and prepared for what might be a contested pickup under enemy fire. Pilot Major Sandra Reynolds had flown dozens of similar missions, but something about tonight felt different. The intelligence they were receiving was too detailed, too precise to come from normal reconnaissance assets, and she wondered what kind of unit was providing such accurate battlefield information. Rashid attempted one final assault as he realized his prey was escaping, ordering his remaining fighters to pursue the Americans regardless of casualties. But the Phantom Marksman had anticipated this response and was already in position to interdict the pursuit. Taliban fighters advancing through the darkness found themselves taking fire from multiple directions as the lone sniper used terrain and muzzle flash to create the illusion of a much larger force engaging them. Morrison's squad reached the extraction point with minimal casualties, their tactical withdrawal having succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations given their initial circumstances. The Marines established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone and waited for their helicopters to arrive, still uncertain about the identity of the guardian angel who had made their survival possible. Williams swept the surrounding ridgelines with his rifle scope, hoping to catch a glimpse of their mysterious benefactor. The helicopters touched down exactly on schedule, their crews ready for immediate departure as soon as the Marines were aboard. Morrison was the last man to board, taking one final look at the mountainous terrain where they had spent the longest night of their military careers. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a lone operator was probably already disappearing into the landscape, his mission complete and his identity destined to remain forever classified. As the helicopters lifted off and banked toward friendly territory, Morrison finally allowed himself to believe they were going to survive. 8 Marines had entered that valley, and 8 Marines were leaving it, thanks to the intervention of someone whose name they would never know and whose existence they could never officially acknowledge. The Phantom Marksman had given them a second chance at life, and Morrison was determined to make sure his men never forgot the debt they owed to their unknown savior. The after-action reports would describe their survival as the result of enemy tactical errors and superior Marine Corps training, with no mention of outside intervention or classified operations. Morrison understood the necessity of such omissions but privately knew that they had been saved by someone operating far beyond the normal parameters of military engagement. The silent guardian had appeared when all hope seemed lost and vanished again into the darkness, leaving behind only the grateful survivors of what should have been a massacre. Years later, Morrison would occasionally wonder about the identity of their mysterious protector, but he knew such questions could never be answered. Some heroes operate in complete anonymity, their deeds known only to those they save and the shadows they call home.